Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's episode, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Arnaud, Postdoctoral Associate at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy at Western University. Sarah's research interests lie in the area of philosophy of psychology and psychiatry, and philosophy of mind, mainly on emotion, consciousness, and autism. Her current research focuses primarily on unconscious emotions, self-consciousness, and the relations between emotion and perception. Sarah is one of the founders and organizers of Philosophy, which promotes the presence and impact of women, trans-inclusive, in philosophy, and a co-founder and organizer of the webinar in Philosophy of Psychiatry. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Sarah. Dr. Sarah Arnaud, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Monday morning?
Hi, Nicholas. I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Very well. You can call me Nick as well, but I appreciate the formality. That's very kind of you.
Okay.
Yeah. How are things out in the Rotman Institute in Western University? Are you calling us from there?
I'm in Montreal right now, but
okay, wonderful.
Things there are very good. Yeah, the Rotman is a great institution, and it's been going very well. I have great colleagues, and I have great projects there. So yeah, everything is fine.
Very good to hear. And so in Montreal, what's any interesting plans for the semester? Anything particular going on?
So, well, I'm on several projects, like in collaboration, actually, for papers, but also on my own. And, I'm going to the PSA, the Philosophy of Science Association conference in November in Pittsburgh, where you're at, probably.
I will be here. Excited to attend. I did not. I won't be presenting this time around, but I will. I'll certainly be participating. Be a warm body and at the conference. So it will be good. But that's good. That should be fun.
Yeah, and I also. I mean, I'm always organizing things here and there. So these things will keep going during the semester. I'm organizing this Philosophy of Psychiatry webinar.
This is fascinating. So I've seen. Yeah. So I mean, I've been familiar with it. I've tuned in on Zoom a few times over the last year. You've had some terrific speakers. So you can say a little more about it. But I've been really impressed by it. Tell us what's been going on with this.
Thank you. We've been very lucky, actually, to have all these amazing speakers agreeing to come and talk about their research. So. Well, basically the idea was to, during COVID, we thought with my colleague, Anne-Marie Gagné-Julien, to organize something online with philosophers of psychiatry. And we thought it's actually an opportunity to have people from all over the world, because we couldn't do it in person. And we realized that there was some kind of demand for that, like all the philosophers of psychiatry agreed to come there and to come talk to us. And so, they come talk about their research. It can be in any fields, about philosophy of psychiatry or like a subtopic of that. And, they present their research or talk, something for 45 minutes. And then someone, some time is allocated for questions. So we've been very lucky so far. We do that every 2 weeks. We started in January 2021 and, it's still going on. So Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm doing. I'm also doing things at the Rotman where
Sure.
Yeah, there I have this kind of reading group / working group in feelings and psychiatry. That's
Interesting.
the topic of it. Yes. The idea there was to have like everyone interested in mind related to emotions, consciousness, feelings, or philosophy of psychiatry, gathered together to talk about papers that are written in the recent years, and also work on our own research projects if we have some that we want to present to the group. And so we also meet very regularly at the Rotman, and that's been very fascinating. So this is also going on for my fall.
Wonderful. If you won't mind me asking, so I mentioned before we got on, I have an interest in philosophy of psychiatry. Definitely working on a project currently. My training is more in like philosophy of science in practice kind of approaches. But as you mentioned, this reading group gets together other folks in more traditional analytic philosophy, I imagine, like things like philosophy of mind, philosophy of motion, or maybe you're referencing those things from a philosophy of science perspective. But I'm curious, like, what it's been like getting everybody together to discuss like these topics, and what that is. I don't know, how have you seen that sort of collaboration or that engagement going?
That's very interesting, because I think we're all coming with different backgrounds and maybe with different ideas in mind of what that reading group or working group could be. And I wanted to keep it as broad as possible so that we can build it together. So that's why I had this very broad name, like feelings and psychiatry can mean a lot of things. And so some people there are PhD students, some are postdocs, some are faculty. We have people the Rotman is great because there are like a lot of collaborations between philosophers and scientists. And so we have people from the psychology department coming too, and our areas of expertise, but also interests are very different. So what we do is that we all suggest some readings and then we vote for the one we want to work on. And it makes this group very interesting, because when we meet, some people are expert on some questions that we're talking about and some are not at all. And but that changes, from one week to the other. And we learn a lot from each other. So it's true that some of us have like a more analytic tradition. Some of us have more like a philosophy of science expertise. Some are more in philosophy of psychiatry. Some are more in philosophy of mind.
Right.
I think I've been pursuing these two areas in parallel, like the phil mind and the phil of psychiatry. And to be able to have people interested in both is amazing, and talk with them. So what I think that some people are interested in emotions, some in psychiatry, and there what we do is that we're reading a lot about the experiential component of psychiatric categories. And that brings everything together, which has been very, very interesting.
Yeah. So I know there's like a phenomenology tradition in studying phenomenology in psychiatry, but perhaps there is this other phil mind focus on emotion as well that, I could see like just focusing on and then problems of intersubjectivity and subjectivity could be really, I think, broadened by those fruitful discussions. So
absolutely, because I think none of us is really coming from like phenomenology expertise background or school of thought, but I think you're right. It's more like the topics of philosophy of mind are actually relevant for the philosophy of psychiatry, right? When it comes to emotions and consciousness and feelings and first person perspectives on things. Even perception is really important. We've been reading on anorexia recently and on how like the body is perceived and what like a first person experience is compared to the clinical descriptions. And so I think there is room for this mix between film mind and of psychiatry that we've been finding in this group. Yeah.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I'm very excited to hear how the story about how you came to Rotman, how you found your way into combining these things, and a number of great activities you've been doing, service activities as well as just research and social engagement projects within at the Rotman and then within your own research. So let's go back to the beginning. Tell us, Sarah, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in France, as you can probably tell. And I was born near Lyon, but I moved to between several cities when I was a kid with my parents. I finally moved to Paris when I was 18 to start university there. My family is in Toulouse, where I was in high school. And I have two brothers in Paris.
Wonderful. A family. So, okay. Well, tell us a little about growing up before university. What were some of your interests? Was it philosophy all the way, or were there other things, arts, sciences, anything? Other things completely unrelated to philosophy,
Well, so I mean, in the French system, we don't really study philosophy before the very last year of high school. So I knew nothing about philosophy, except, as a kid having philosophical questions, like every kid, well, more or less. But when I was a kid, I was a heavy reader. So I was very interested in stories. And my mother is a heavy reader too. And she made me discover a lot of stories of fictions, and I was reading I got fed up with kids' books pretty young, so I started reading her detective novels and dramas, and I was also writing a lot of completely invented stories with notably with one of my cousins. So we would, create these scenarios with people that were parts of very complicated families. So we would draw family trees and create all these stories. So I think, I was very interested in reading and fiction, and I think that at school, I was more in it's interesting because in the French system, you kind of have to choose between being someone, interested in literature or interested in science. Yeah. And, so I'm in philosophy of science now, but I chose the literature option, pretty early on. And, when you're age 15 or 16, you really have to choose your program in high school, and the program can be literature, and that will encompass humanities and languages, or economy or science. Mm-hmm. And I chose the literature one, and that's where I discovered philosophy, but at the very end of it. And philosophy is it's something that comes very late, as I told you, but that you have way more if you choose the literature option.
Right. Okay. So you went to Paris to study at this university. How was your time? How was your time studying there?
I mean, it was great. I chose philosophy, and I went to Paris. I think the idea was that I could go to the Sorbonne, where a lot of professors were teaching there, and I was thinking that it could be great to learn from them. So I learned a lot from them, and it was a new interest, as I told you, because actually before that I wanted to study Spanish. So I had like been interested in all the language, the culture,
right, yeah.
and I wanted to study Spanish, and I wanted to write some novels, some fictions, and I ended up choosing philosophy because in high school I discovered that, got passionate. So when I went to Paris, it was really because I had discovered something and wanted to go deeper in the existential questions. But I didn't know much, about philosophy. And I discovered that, well, philosophy is very rich, has like, it touches every topic. And so, yes, my undergrad there was great. I think it was very, how could you say that? We studied the classics, at least at the time when I was there. So what some would call the canon, And so it was a lot of history of philosophy. You work on Plato and Aristotle, and then you see the moderns with Descartes, and then when you learn about morality, it's going to be with Kant, and you touch a bit about like phenomenology, existentialism, but there it's like the German philosophers, and but I had like fascinating classes. So I remember really, really wanting to understand Heidegger, and I had that class actually with Alexander Schnell, who was like a passionate about Fichte and Schelling, and he would like teach us. So and I would learn about Hegel, but I didn't have much philosophy of science during my undergrads.
That's what I'm catching. So it was more. So it sounds to me like a more traditional philosophical. Traditional in the French tradition, or in a more of a great courses canon approach, which I think generally I wouldn't call so much to favor, but it seems like there's a lot going for it. I would favor it, actually. But yeah. So okay. So how did things happen in your history with like? How did you not become, or why didn't you go into ancient philosophy or something like that, as we would understand it or classify it now? What led you to philosophy of science?
I mean, that's true that until there, and until then, I mean, I was into literature and very different type of philosophy. And so I had a course on, so that was at the end of my undergrad. We had like a mandatory class on logic, formal logic. And I got passionate about that. So remember, I had chosen literature in high school. Right. So I had kind of stopped science, and because I had to choose that when I was 16, I had kind of abandoned maths and physics and biology. So I didn't have a very strong scientific background. And I discovered logic, and I enjoyed it so much that I chose to start a master's in philosophy of science and logic. So maybe I wanted to be a little bit controversial too, I suppose, because my friends were not going there at all. But I don't know. I think formal logic made me go there. And there I discovered PhilMind and cognitive science. But among other things, I mean, I discovered philosophy of language and philosophy of biology and general philosophy of science. And that was fascinating. So it was a big contrast with my undergrads, for sure. And it was difficult because my scientific background was not high enough to become very good in all these fields. But I remember, this classes with Thomas Pradeux in philosophy of biology, with Max Kissler in philosophy of physics, and general philosophy of science with Daniel Landler, who became my PhD supervisor in Paris, and that I learned so much. I had that class in philosophy of cognitive science with Pascal Ludwig, who became my master's advisor, supervisor, and he introduced us to the very not original classics, Frank Jackson's thought experiments about Mary, who doesn't see colors.
Right. Yeah.
And suddenly she sees red, and what does it feel like to see red? And does she learn something? And I thought that question was fascinating. And that's, I think, one of my first, I don't know, epiphany. That would be a bit strong, but realization that I wanted to do that. I wanted to understand that kind of things. I became fascinated with questions on feelings and consciousness and phenomenology, but broadly understood.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. I can certainly relate actually to taking a consciousness class in undergrad and learning about the Mary thought experiment, being like, oh my gosh. And also the ideas of just learning about the way in which we might react, or a lot of our general everyday is not conscious. And I was just like, what? This doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
My gosh. And then and so no, it's stuck with me for quite a while. It continues to. It's narrowed, in focus in terms of
it's narrowed, and I understand that too.
Yeah.
It's it becomes very different when you dig into it and you start seeing, well, the little things that in the thought experiment don't work very well. All these philosophers have worked on it, and what other questions can be more important, more interesting, that are not necessarily from thought experiments, but from real life and
right.
Yeah. And that's, in philosophy of psychiatry, you might see that too, that we are in a field that relate to questions that are pressing in some ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Or the thought is, you make them, you focus on questions that are pressing, relevant. So it could be socially relevant, could be medically relevant. They don't have to be, but they often are. So that's fascinating. And that should be a plug for thought experiments. Not only are they helpful, but they're helpful of getting people hooked on the topics with which they're interested in, or they at least get people introduced to them as well.
Yes, you're right. So, but I would say that they're probably not necessary, and
fair enough.
We have enough things happening in our social world that should make us wonder and think and try to go deeper in some topics. And I think I told you about my film mind interest, but I think that my philosophy of psychiatry interest came from another path.
Okay, tell us about that. Yeah, so obviously we've traced a little bit from traditional and historical philosophies to film minds, but then so how are we? Tell us a little bit about. Well, did psychiatry come fairly soon after that? Did you have a portion where you were working more in film mind and then found psychiatry? Yeah, tell us, how did that go?
Okay, well, I think it came more or less at the same time. So it's actually mixed with another part of my life, because at the time of my undergrad and then later during my master's, I was in Paris, and so I had to work because Paris is an expensive city, and so I had worked primarily with children, and during my master's, I worked with autistic children, and I realized that autism was not still very well understood, that the idea that we had on autism or that I had at least, contrasted with what I felt during my interactions with autistic people there. And it seemed that all the experiential part was actually forgotten, not taken into account, that all the descriptions of autism were about theory of mind, reasoning, language, that just didn't seem to capture what autism was or looked like. And I started to work on emotions in autism at the time and being interested in that. So it was still, mixed with my interest in philosophy of mind and emotions, but it was also related to the fact that how we were describing some psychiatric categories were not matching at all with I don't know, at least the experience I had. And I also, I broadened that a little bit to other psychiatric categories. When a person very close to me started struggling with mental illness and committed suicide, and that made me really dig deeper in the understanding of mental health. And I think at that time I thought that more should be done or understood, and maybe not just more, but differently. That there was this contrast between the idea that we have of mental health and what's really going on, and how research is describing it, and how clinical settings are made. And so, that's my other path.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. So I've seen, like, I can see at your CV, you have several publications related to autism, exploring, experiential, perceptual, interests in these. So, yeah. So, for those who might be interested in philosophy, but then don't quite know, how would you, you mentioned at one point earlier on, okay, I want to do this. Having these experience with thought experiments, but then how do you, what kind of path do you take to go and actually start working on problems like this? Like, what kinds of questions do you need to address? How do you separate, just general forms of interest from then like actual focused like research questions in philosophy of psychiatry? Like, how did that path come to be, to learning and going forward to studying? I imagine it was a formal course of study, for example, like going, doing the PhD and everything like that. But yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. So I had I think there are several paths that people can take to do that. So
Great.
I have the impression that a lot of people who work in philosophy of psychiatry draw from their personal experience, whether they are, themselves psychiatrized or know people who struggle with mental illness, or so there is sometimes that personal component that make people interested. And then in philosophy, there are these questions about how the mind works. So if you come from, or if you're interested in philosophy of mind, there's going to be a lot about how do we differentiate between ways of cognizing in the world. And yep. I think that's where I came from. I had wondered about like the diversity of ways of perceiving the world. And it seems that in a lot of psychiatric categories, what's going on is that there are different ways of experiencing, different ways of understanding. And very, very much and very often, maybe more in the past, but it's still a little bit there, these things are very much pathologized. So we have this idea that there must be some kind of norm or of ways of cognizing, perceiving, thinking, feeling, and that everything that departs from that is pathology or not okay or should be put back on the right track. And I think that a very interesting way to study philosophy of psychiatry is to wonder about these and to wonder about these norms and how they're built and what actually make them being there, and do they actually capture something real, or isn't all this completely socially constructed, and why? And so these are deep philosophical questions that can be worked on with, reading a lot, taking classes on philosophy of science, philosophy of psychiatry, on other fields like psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, and maybe philosophy of mind. It's not necessarily the path that you should take, but that's the path I had. But I think there are many ways to study this, and I think a lot of people study, for example, neuroscience or psychology, and they get very interested in philosophical questions and these kind of questions that I told you about, but it can be much more precise or on some category in particular, or on, a lot of philosophers got interested in theory of mind and were trying to see how it works in different ways of cognizing and etc. It might be a weird response, but I don't think there is one way to get there. The philosophy of psychiatry is and should be really a field where there is a lot of interactions between different researchers, different fields.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would include one. It's not. I don't know if I would recommend this path if you want to do specifically philosophy of psychiatry, but it's to become a psychiatrist first. I don't know if you've been to these meetings where you meet and it's been like half philosophers, half psychiatrists. And the philosophers are wondering, maybe I should have been a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrists are wondering, maybe I should have been a philosopher, because they're so fascinated by each other's questions, by each other's fields. It's sort of like a grass is greener thing. But what I'm saying is, and in my own research, I've interviewed and interacted with these folks that some of them I see are forthcoming in your, in the philosophy of psychiatry, webinar, where it's like they're psychiatry or, either clinical psychologists or psychiatrists with philosophical leanings very strongly. And so they just kind of, again, that's not a traditional, for those of who are listening to this program, it's like, it just shows that like this, and this, perhaps maybe more so. I mean, psychiatry is just it can be so broad and so touching that like people, in other, in not just like scientific, but also like in medical, because it's like a clinical practice profession. There, can be understood in that way. Like there's a practice of it. That, maybe you want to separate it from the understanding of the experience and the feelings, but that's just involved. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in all of we just said, I completely agree with you that there is this interest of some researchers for other researchers' fields. I think it illustrates the broad aspect of what philosophy of psychiatry is and what psychiatry is. And one very important path or area or how can I say, perspective to take into account is the one of people who have a psychiatric category that they associate with themselves. And that's like, that perspective is the one that that I think is important to take into account when we start researching or when we start developing some interests in philosophy of psychiatry.
So are you referring to sort of the discussion in terms of not just, so one, it's about providing people that those you mentioned, you referring to folks as psychiatrists or folks who would identify as experiencing and being living with the experience of something related to mental illness, whatever, but or whatnot. But also the idea that if we're going to build some sort of category or sort of build some knowledge around a particular thing, we should maybe should consider taking what they say into account. Is that getting to that question of sort of whether, like, maybe that's going beyond what you're referring to, but yeah.
No, that's exactly that. And I think there is an increasing literature on that question of first person perspective.
That's what I mean.
That is very important. But yes, the idea is that people with lived experience can actually and should be included in the questions and in the research about psychiatry. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Well, so what was tell us about your experience studying. So you studied at Paris Sorbonne, working with Luc Fauché, who I've met at one of these psychiatry meetings, and Daniel Andler. But tell us, a little about that experience and what did you end up kind of working on and going toward to defend?
Sure. Okay. So I started a PhD in a joint supervision between Paris and Montreal in Canada. So
right.
That's where I worked with Luc Fauché, who was my supervisor in Montreal, while Daniel Andler was the one in Paris. And I actually had talked to Daniel Andler about going there, and he was very supportive of the idea. He knew Luc Fauché, and he knew that the system was going to be very different, which was true. It is very different. So I arrived in Montreal for a part of my PhD, just doing a part of my PhD, and I ended up
interesting.
Staying there until the end. So the system is very different. I think that PhD students, at least during my time as a PhD student, they are more considered as researchers in maybe North America, but at least where I was in Montreal than in Paris, where it was a little bit more a lonely situation, if I can say. When I was studying in Paris, you didn't have a lot of interactions with researchers, and way less, reading groups, conferences, et cetera, that you were invited to be a part of. So It's when I arrived in Montreal that I realized everything about the job, that I didn't even know I could apply for PhD programs when I started my PhD. Yeah. So I arrived there and I realized, I'm going to have to write papers and to talk at conferences, and I learned a little bit about the job market, and that was great. I mean, I was very lucky and happy to be there and learn about all this. So that's where I started to become less of a student and more of something like a researcher.
Right. The shift happens.
So.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
No. Yeah.
So it was great. I still had classes like you have when you do a PhD, but research became an important part of what I was doing, and I had a great guidance with Luc Fauché. I got very lucky to work under his supervision. I understood, step by step what it was to do a PhD in philosophy. When I see my peers and people around me now, I feel like it arrived late for me to understand what I was into, and what I was doing. Yeah.
Sure. Well, you eventually figure it. Yeah. I can relate a little bit to that experience coming from a slightly different background, but just, coming in to understand like the logistic, like just like the values of what it means to do, what it means to be a professional philosopher or professional researcher who, uses these tools. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to hear too the differences between, I suppose, what I imagine are both great universities, and great programs, but just the differences in the social culture and like the availability of things, activities, or at least what you found to be available at the time.
Yes, that's true, and
how important those can be. Yeah.
You're right. It's also hard to compare completely because I left Paris. I was still young and at the very beginning of my PhD. So It might have, been similar to my experience in Montreal had I stayed longer there. I don't know. So yeah, but it's, just about, working, for example, when I arrived in Montreal, I was able to work in the field. So I could be a teaching assistant and a research assistant, and I started doing that there. So, and I could, have some grants from research groups and be involved in things that were giving a little bit of money, actually, related to philosophy. And that makes you way more part of the field and feel like you actually are professionalizing in a way that I hadn't found yet when I was in France. I started like teaching a little bit. I was I think I discovered all this in Montreal, and I got my first teaching position as a lecturer while I was actually finishing my thesis. So that was also a great experience there. My first class was in aesthetics.
I see here. Yeah.
Not really my field. So I learned so much from that. I think I was preparing my class like 6.5 days a week and teaching it the seventh, and I learned probably at least as much, maybe more than my students. Hopefully they learned too. But and that, if I had been told when I was doing my master's in Paris that someday I would teach philosophy, I think I would have not believed it. I was a student in France, not really realizing that I was going to be a professional in philosophy any time. Like, I didn't know that.
It's an interesting shift between becoming more like almost like a consumer. You're not a consumer and whatever, but you're more of like just a learner, or someone who is in the active process of learning, versus then the person who is creating professionalizing things like that. I could see it as it's a big shift that can happen. Yeah. It doesn't happen.
Yes, it is.
So for some, it happens right away. For some, it's like they've always been doing work, and that didn't make sense to me. It was, I can relate. I can understand that. Fantastic. So right away, jumping into some teaching opportunities, teaching what you don't know, always fun because you get to learn so much more.
Yes, that's true.
But then, so you had a really great, sounds like it looks here, you had a really great opportunity. So graduating from the PhD program and then getting to do a postdoc at the City University of New York. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, so at the end of my thesis, I applied for a Canadian grant that allowed me to go to New York for my first postdoc. And I worked under Jesse Prince's supervision, who was actually a researcher that I was very interested in. Like, I had used his work during my master's and then during my PhD, because he theorized emotions in ways that were very fascinating to me. And I arrived in New York. And I had the chance to work under his supervision, which was great. I learned a lot. So when I was there, I got, I started working on papers, and he was very helpful for that. I started working on papers that were, at the crossroads between emotions and the topic of autism. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I published first. I also attended that were there. So I had the chance to be at David Rosenthal's seminar on consciousness and David Papineau's seminar on philosophy of mind and consciousness as well. It was amazing. I really learned a lot. I also met PhD students there that were very smart and had interests that were very close to mine. So I started working with some of them, and I collaborated with, now a person who is still my collaborator, Kate Pendley, there, who works on emotions. And I organized some workshops. I attended and participated in some conferences. I also discovered that the New York community is very, very big about, philosophy of mind. And that was great. I stayed 2 years there, and I learned a lot. I learned too about the job market there. It was the first time for me that I was really on the job market. I had applied for that grant, and I had that grant. And so I was there during my first postdoc without knowing what the job market was really. Yeah. So I learned, and I started applying for jobs, and it went very fast during these 2 years. I was very happy in New York, but I had great opportunities after that. I'm still very happy actually where I'm at. I think I'm very lucky.
Yeah. So 2 years postdoc in New York, or 2 years in New York. And then, so you've been at Western since, or at the Rotman Institute, since 2021. Was it for something like that? So
actually, after New York, I came back to Montreal and I started teaching there. Okay. It was 2020. Because I graduated. So I finished my PhD in 2018. I went 2 years in New York. I came back to Montreal during COVID. I started teaching there. I had in Quebec, they have these colleges, these institutions between secondary school and university where there is some mandatory philosophy. So it's kind of colleges in the US. I think it's very similar. So I started working there. I taught philosophy during 2021. It was all online, but that was very interesting. I love teaching actually. And also I had for a few months a postdoc, with Amandine Catala, who is professor at UQAM, and she has that Canadian research chair on epistemic agency and epistemic injustices. And I worked there a few months too, and then I got another postdoc in Antwerp, in Belgium.
Okay.
So I went there and worked, and it was great too. So it was under Benson and I's supervision, and he works on perception, and I had this interest in comparing emotions and perception, and there I had a great experience too with a lot of people that I learned a lot from, who were working on emotions, on perceptions, on mental health. So it was a great crowd for me. I learned a lot there too. And then I came to London. That's where I am right now. So I started my current postdoc in March 2022. So it's very recent.
Fair enough. Okay. Right. So,
yes.
Great. but again, so you've had been having some, I would say, like amazing experiences. So I've been interested because I guess I've known in the background about the Rotman Institute, just from like having met Jacqueline Sullivan, and
Yes.
but at the same time, like now I'm starting to pour into it. I'm like, this looks so cool. Like this is like what, like just they're reading their mission statement, or I mean, and then also even just learning about this at Antwerp, the Center for Philosophical Psychology, these like centers that are just like offshoots of, the traditional philosophy departments. But then, so like, what's it like being at, Rotman, or like being at, somewhere that's like, so CUNY, is known for their philosophy of mind. So there's almost, even though maybe there is a center, but there's not, I don't know, there's a lot of activity, but somewhere where it's like this official thing that has excited. Yeah. What's it like to be, a fellow there, to feel, to a part of this research community? I mean, I guess I don't think you have anything necessarily to compare it against, but like compared to, just a traditional postdoc at, whatever R1 kind of a thing. What's it like being a part of this, community?
So it's great. First, I mean, I am very lucky to be supervised by Jackie Sullivan.
Right.
She is also a researcher that I had admired and read before starting any postdoc, actually, while I was doing my PhD. And now working with her is great. I mean, I feel very privileged. And she has that background in philosophy of neuroscience. And so, and I don't, so it's a very, huge learning opportunity for me. I am, so I'm working with her on a project that we want to pursue, soon. But of course, there's so many things going on that, I mean, it might take a little bit of time before we publish it, but she's the director of a group on philosophy and philosophy of neuroscience and psychiatry, and she's supervising PhD students that are working on ADHD, that are working on psychedelics, and I'm learning a lot from that. So it's amazing to be a part of the Rotman for that kind of things. I have a lot of interactions with researchers that work on fascinating topics that I don't know much about, but that are not that far away from mine. And we actually can start collaborating. So one of Jackie's PhD students is working on body dysmorphic disorders, and I had worked on interoception, the feeling of your body internally, related to autism. And so together we're starting working on interoception and anorexia, which is something completely new for me. I'm jumping here a little bit forward maybe in my current interests, but and projects, but like, and this is part of a broader project that became a broader project. Like we had started talking about our interests, but now we're writing this paper with Jackie. She's going to be part of the project, and with also psychologists, which is like a richness of the Rotman. It's that it's situated in this building that also has like the Mind and Brain Institute and a lot of researchers that are from scientific fields. So we're working now on an experiment, an empirical part of the paper where we're going to interview patients. And so for that, we're working with psychologists that are in the same building. But the Rotman gives that kind of opportunities. So it's been very, very great. It's also a place where I met, the other postdocs there that are working on other subfield of philosophy of science. So my colleagues are interested in philosophy of biology and philosophy of physics, and these can appear as very far from what I do, but actually we are noticing that, between philosophy of biology and philosophy of psychiatry, there are a lot of common questions, and yeah, the Rotman is great for that kind of interactions. It's very
Wonderful.
unique. Mm-hmm.
No, well, that's absolutely wonderful to hear. I mean, that's what I was hoping a center like that would be, but it's good to hear it directly from someone who's experiencing or is part of the program currently. So,
yes, the center is very, I would say, active and productive. There are a lot of conferences, events, lectures, invited speakers. There's always something to do. There's always something to attend, to learn from, to see, to listen to. So yeah, it's a very active center. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, so why don't tell us? Well, so I'm interested in a couple of questions. One, tell us a little bit about the work you've done with autism. Perhaps I'm sure some of us we hear about autism, the study of autism. We hear about different claims being made. But and you've mentioned kind of earlier in our chat, about how the experience, either the feeling or the emotive component has been somewhat neglected, perhaps in the nosological or psychological or psychiatric research or communication, at least. Tell us a little bit about kind of what it is, what kinds of things why. So kind of what has been interesting about and about studying autism in the way in which you do, and what kinds of things that you hope have you been trying to say and in relation to it?
So I think I changed my. There were some changes in my research, and I got interested in autism. Specifically about the emotional component, because there was at the time, and I think it's been changing for the best, but at the time there was that kind of ideas that emotions in autism were not present, or that empathy was problematic,
right,
or what, and that felt totally wrong, according to my experience. And I thought at the time, okay, what's going on in emotions and autism? Why is there this? Where is this idea coming from? And what's actually happening? And so I started working on emotional consciousness in autism, and my idea was that autistic people and non-autistic people have different ways to access their feelings, and that's what I tried to write about and to explain and to research. And my PhD. Hello. Oh, I can't see any. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm still here.
Okay. Great. So yeah, that's what I started to work on, and then I more recently got interested in first-person perspectives. So a lot of autistic people have been making the research on autism less stigmatized, more and autism itself better understood. And so I've been working on the activist movements that or more generally say the new narratives that are emerging on autism. And that's what I'm really trying to work on right now. It's how can we integrate these new narratives, and instead of having something that could seem very polarized between clinical and clinical settings or research settings, and on the other way, autistic people's perspectives and description of autism, how can we reconcile these things, and how so I'm working on how the new narratives in psychiatry and the search for recognition and inclusion of autistic people, but also more broadly of people who have psychiatric labels, how to reconcile these with the current like scientific research and understanding of these categories. So that's really what interests me now. And what I'm trying to show is that if we want to do good science, we need to start with these perspectives, and that there's this wrong dichotomy, that false, dilemma between activism and scientific research. And I think that comes from, anti-psychiatry movements in the past, like century, that have evolved in a very different way now. So yeah, I am really interested in how we can reconcile these things, and how the first person perspectives bring important and necessary knowledge that should be taken into account for scientific research. So in autism and other categories. Yeah, sorry.
So no, this is great. So in terms of so how does, I guess I should read some more papers on this for my own interest, but so how might first person perspectives just generally be taken into account in informing? So there's two things. There's informing the scientific research, and then there's informing the nosology and the categories, right?
You're right.
Which do you care? I mean, are you interested in both, in in one more than the other? And if so, like how does that look like? How might that look like? Yeah.
So it's so I'm interested in both, because the first reason is that research and nosology are intertwined in the sense that when a researcher wants to do anything on autism that is a little bit empirical, what they do is that they use the DSM as a starting point, even if they criticize it, but to describe autism, or to recruit some people that are going to do an experiment that are autistic versus non-autistic. And in order to do that, they have to have diagnosed people, and these people are diagnosed through these descriptions that are put in the DSM. So I think that nosology and research are very much they go together. Not that they are on the same page. There are a lot of criticisms about the DSM from researchers, and some explain, how it should be used, or how we should see it and not see it as a tool, but not as a scientific book or something like that. But even that makes these two things very much related. And the DSM is supposed to use scientific research to have the best descriptions of psychiatric categories. So I'm interested in both for these reasons. And what I see concretely is that, in research, a lot of presuppositions or ideas of autism have changed through the first person perspective, thanks to the first person perspective. So this idea that on emotions, for example, if you talk to an autistic person, it takes 2 seconds to see that the idea that people with autism don't have emotions is false. And so that's a very, simplistic example, but all the vocabulary. So I'm interested in the nosology part and about the vocabulary that the DSM is using. That is very much pathologizing. And I don't think it's just a question of terminology and that we should just replace, deficit with difference. It's not just that. That is embedded is in a broader stigma about what autism is. And all the, neurodiversity movement, I think, has been showing very efficiently how changing the way we think of autism as not a pathology, not necessarily a disorder, but rather as one cognitive type that is maybe different from other ones. So through a diversity perspective of cognition and maybe neurological development changes the way we do research on autism. An example, if you want a concrete example, is the underdiagnosis of women, for example. So it seems that autism had been described as something that is way more prevalent in men than women. And one of the things that has been brought by autistic women is how their autism was kind of masked, or that the description of the DSM was just not really describing, encompassing what autism is and how it manifests for women. And so the descriptions of autism by autistic women shows a new picture that, if taken into account, changes the nosology, changes the diagnosis, changes the understanding of autism in general. And so that's one of the example of how first person perspective is actually useful to reach a better understanding of autism. And I believe it's the case for many psychiatric categories. I'm right there with you. My own personal project is understanding the relationship between psychiatric research and nosology, and trying to get at how much nosology perhaps shapes research and vice versa. Yes. And starting to learn more about these questions related to validators and understanding what it means to validate psychiatric categories, but also just been fascinated with just how much things just work either work together, but are often, psychiatry is unique in that it's one of the only forms of medicine where research will go one way and categories will go another way, or or you'll just ignore the categories. A lot of research just ignores I just talked to someone recently where they're just we don't even keep a DSM on the shelf where we research. We just do, we just do it. Or I think for example, in intervention work, a lot of folks where they're more like psychologists, where they're wanting to let's say develop successful interventions for depression for teens. They really just care about making the teens they just really care about well-being and making them feel better. But at the same time, I'm still one who's more I share so some people have gone completely the opposite direction of just feeling I don't really care about the categories, and I'm more interested in just improving the research. But there is this kind of sense where I don't know, with certain things, I know there's some, I imagine, I'm curious. One consideration for in terms of how, I'm not sure if this is how the research changes the categories, but things with Asperger's syndrome being removed from the DSM thing. So what was your, perhaps this was a good movement. I know other things have been written about this more formally and, but, is this something that you've seen in terms of, studying the activist movements and whatnot, how have they perceived these sort of shifts, pretty drastic shifts in structuring of categories? Yeah, so several things about that. Autistic people don't necessarily constitute one voice that is unified, and that. Right. But it's true that there were some reactions to that change. So in 2013, in the new DSM, instead of having 5 developmental disorders, as they called it, they regrouped that into that broad autistic spectrum disorders. And so Asperger syndrome being one of them just, got put in that broader label of ASD. And I think that how do you say that? reason that was given for that change was that there was not really a clear cut between Asperger and classic autism, or whatever they were however they were calling it at the time, but that there was no really like good way to differentiate these things, and that the idea behind the difference was just that, you know, some people who had like more integration in their social environment were gonna be called Asperger, or people who were using verbal language were gonna be called Asperger, when others would be called autistic. So, I mean, there were a lot of different reactions. Some people felt like they were losing their label and diagnosis, like suddenly, when they were, you know, Asperger, and suddenly that was just disappearing from the categories. So of course that can be a little bit struggling or complicated. And others were considering that was actually a good inclusive move, because then, you know, the idea that, we should, like, until a certain point, call people autistic, and then like to another extent call people Asperger without any concrete way to make a difference, that was not really justified. So that was a good move. Then I think it depends. But today it seems, and because you're asking me, it seems to me that yes, without justification for having these two categories as separate, it's better to have one broad category, which is autism, knowing that it probably encompasses a lot of, you know, of different people, of different ways of cognizing, of different, like, we live in a diverse world. So even among autistic people, there is a huge diversity. And I think that's something important to keep in mind. Should we have more labels and more subcategories? Maybe. I don't know. And maybe we will know more with time and with research. But if the options are, should we keep Asperger syndrome as like a category or not? Right now, it seems that the latter is probably the best option.
Sure. Yeah, I would just, no, thank you. That's really helpful just to understand. I think what I gathered specifically is just there's a diverse of, you know, there's not like this one voice where it's like, well, what do the activists like? It's not just like this one group or something like that. There's a lot of people from a variety of different perspectives, important perspectives and positions that are going to comment and maybe also see this again. It's like, it is good in some ways, maybe not as good as, or, you know, if we're going to be normative about it, make some sort of judgment concerning these considerations. But so I mean, what fascinates, I mean, I'm really interested in this kind of these approaches, and I think, I mean, it would be great to see. I'm sure this is probably also like another cycle in the, you know, history of psychiatry sphere, where you're right, where first person's perspectives are now becoming. We're starting, well, and maybe it's with the tools that we're doing, like they're becoming more of a thing now that, I don't know if it's not necessarily the tools, but it's just, it's coming back in some ways. Maybe there's just better arguments or there's just different, okay. So you've done some really, you know, so there's some really interesting work again with the, you know, moving from, those very early on sort of maybe, kind of rudimentary descriptions of autism and emotion and now toward the experience, first person's perspective. So, I mean, so in approaching things like anorexia this way, is it similarly like so in terms of this project with, anorexia nervosa, like what are you hoping to, so what does exposure into emotion, interoception and connection with the body, like what does that, hope to bring us?
So I think the hope, if we want to be hopeful, is to have like a better causal story of anorexia, because right now there are a lot of data that are that could be, I think, gathered together to give a better picture of anorexia. And why do we need a better picture? It's because anorexia has the highest like mortality rate of all psychiatric disorders, and so that makes like treatments very. It seems that treatments are very inefficient, and so we need a better understanding, a better picture. So the hope here is to gather together studies that are about interoception, so the feeling of the body, studies on emotions in anorexia, because there are lots of these studies, and studies that are more focused on sense of control, sense of agency, and see if we can see an explanation on the interactions of these different manifestations. That would be the hope. I mean,
of course, yeah.
I am not going to do that on my own, but like I think that I'm interested in research that is leaning towards that, and it seems that a lot of researchers today are trying to find this kind of answers.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. And so I know you mentioned there's several, you have a few things. Is there anything else like, I guess, time for like present day things, like exciting things you're either working on or excited about, either other projects or activities as well. I know we talked somewhat about the webinar for philosophy of psychiatry that you're coordinating and running, getting folks to do this online. Are there any other things that you have going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, in research projects, I'm also trying to work on the risk of essentialism with mental disorders, and how like these days there is this important need of recognition and inclusion of people with mental illness and/or of people with lived experiences, and so I'm trying to see how this can become true, like inclusion and recognition, while like avoiding a risk of essentializing this categories and these people, and how we navigate. Could
you explain what are some of the consequence, like either the epistemic or like the additional consequences to like, or what do you mean by that? Yeah.
So I mean that there is a lot of you can see that in social media, people who are really trying to find recognition and a part of their identity through the categories that we have about mental illness or any psychiatric category, and how that can be done, and how people, and especially young people, can actually be recognized in their mental diversity without essentializing people, and without having this picture of, I need that label, and then I'm stuck with it, and I can't really navigate with it. So that's the questions that I'm interested in. But this is still on the research projects. Say,
No, that's a nice way of putting that. I mean, yeah, I like the way you frame. I don't know. I like the way you frame it. It's hard if you haven't been on social media and, or at least like have followed, a big push toward, I would say like identifying like mental disorders. They're moving from mental disorder categories to like social categories. So like things like ADHD and neurodiverse, especially things like neurodiversity, where they're still maintain a sense of a disorder category, but like the social aspect of like a community building around these categories and seemingly doing their own work to create like, I don't know, criteria, like criteria, like I guess like social criteria, not obviously deliberate diagnostic, but just I'm wondering like what are the impacts of this, and is, I think usually it's done with good intent on the part of individuals or groups, but is there something to be said to, or is something also facilitating that? Like, I think people have been very curious about like what, just in general, like what's been going on with this. And then also, I suppose, when it comes to research or considering the, doing philosophy of the science, like what could be said about this? So,
Yeah, I mean, I share your questions and interests here. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I think that these voices, these groups, these like attempts to be heard have to be heard and taken into account in the way we try to understand psychiatry in general and mental health in general. It seems that there is a need for a switch or for like increasing our knowledge on mental health in a way that stigmatizes less, that includes more, and that is still like able to provide like care to people who need it. And that's not easy. But that's so, yeah.
Good. Wonderful. Okay. No, well, great. Well, we've been talking a long time. Sorry for keeping you so long, but I've really enjoyed learning about these.
Me too.
Well, why don't we follow up with the last question I asked guest, which is, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
The $1 million question. I think that each of subfield in philosophy of science has its own challenges to be very original. But so, and I don't think that they're like necessarily comparable. Like philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, like all the philosophy that works on environment and neuroscience. These are not my fields, and I think they probably have challenges that are as important or more than the ones of psychiatry or philosophy of mind. But in philosophy of psychiatry, I think understanding psychiatric categories and avoid this polarization is one of the pressing issues. Like, how do we create new narratives on mental health that allow to build that bridge between psychiatrized people and psychiatry and scientific research and clinics? I think the challenge is communication and integration. That's a big one that I see for now. It's part of a bigger one that is like the communication between people, between philosophers of science and the science that they are like interested in. So, the communication between philosophers and scientists. I'm probably not the first one to give you that answer, no. But that's part of it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm very happy here. Thank you for sharing your just authentic story about how you came to be, and obviously you're doing the postdoc, so there's much more on the horizon, I imagine, in terms of your research. I'm looking forward to following along, and so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was really fun, and I really like this idea that you had of this podcast. And so, thanks very much for having me. Yes, there is much more to say about about a lot of things, but I'm glad.
Yeah, of course,
to do that.
All right. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll be sure if I happen to be at the PSA, I'll be sure to say hello. And otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your morning. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.